Yeah, mate. Large donor, please. But, do us a favor and go easy on the chili sauce, pal. Seriously, just a drizzle. Yeah, you standing right here with us, you really don't want your mouth completely burned off tonight, do you? I know your tolerance. It's absolutely freezing. Out here anyway. The last thing we need is to be, sweating through our coats while we wait.
I mean, I think the gentleman behind the counter knows exactly what he's doing, but you're right about the cold. It is genuinely biting tonight. And honestly, just look at that neon sign flickering above the window. I swear the frequency of that buzz is giving me a low-grade migraine.
It adds to the late night ambience, but honestly, I am absolutely knackered. And for anyone not familiar with the phrasing, I mean, truly, deeply exhausted in that bone-weary way. I know you are too, and I know you, standing here with us, feel it as well. We've been working all week, absolutely running ourselves into the ground. It's that profound end-of-the-week fatigue where your cognitive load is just maxed out and your brain feels entirely unresponsive.
It is the definitive end-of-the-week crash.
Mm-hmm.
You push your system to its absolute limits, maintaining this facade of high performance, and then suddenly the structural integrity it just gives way. You find yourself standing on a freezing high street at midnight, waiting for roasting meat, realizing you have zero metabolic energy left to even string a coherent sentence together.
Precisely.
Yeah.
But here's the paradox. Despite being completely knackered, my brain simply will not downregulate because of that massive stack of reading we've been obsessing over all week. I've literally been hauling these notes around. And honestly, standing here freezing while the kebab meat sizzles behind the glass feels like the ideal moment to just get into the weeds on this material.
I am entirely in agreement. We have a solid block of time to kill before the food's ready, so why not?
Right, because if I don't vocalize this, my head might actually explode.
It's actually the perfect environment to have a proper look at these concepts. Because if they strip away all the superficial self-help rhetoric, the core of this entire massive library of sources we've been compiling is fundamentally about the architecture of continuity. We are interrogating the actual mechanics of how human beings, and massive complex systems for that matter, sustain themselves over time. Why do we push through the exhaustion? Why do we maintain structural integrity when the environment demands we collapse?
Right. And the very first conceptual knot we have to unpick, which totally reoriented my perspective on my own behavior, by the way, is the conflation of two distinct terms. We use consistency and persistence completely interchangeably in casual conversation. But the sources are militant about the fact that structurally, biologically, and philosophically, they belong to entirely different ontological categories.
They absolutely do. And conflating them is where most strategic planning fails. Let's isolate the variables here. Consider consistency strictly as the structural dimension. It is fundamentally about the absence of contradiction and the minimization of variance. If you look at it through the lens of formal logic or mathematics, a theoretical framework is consistent if it does not contradict itself within its own set of axioms. You cannot assert that a variable is both x and not x simultaneously.
So it's about regularity and predictability within a bounded system. If a process is consistent, it is uniform. It's exactly like the protocol in this shop right now.
How so?
Well, the meat rotates on that spit at a highly specific, calibrated RPM. It is subjected to a specific thermal load. It is changed off at a specific angle. That consistency ensures that the output remains within a highly defined tolerance range, completely independent of external variables like whether it's a quiet Tuesday afternoon or a chaotic freezing Friday night. The nature of the action is invariant.
Exactly. Consistency is entirely focused on the nature and the quality of the state itself. But persistence introduces the temporal dimension. Persistence is the vector of time acting upon a state.
The length of the timeline.
Right. In behavioral terms, it is the quality of continuing a course of action in spite of difficulty, environmental opposition, or a complete lack of immediate positive feedback. In computer science, we define persistence as the characteristic of a state that outlives the process that created it. For us, biologically, it is that raw volitional drive to maintain forward momentum when every homeostatic signal in your body is screaming at you to stop.
Therefore, if consistency is the act of executing your morning routine with zero deviation, brushing your teeth with the exact same mechanical motion every day. Persistence is the act of lacing up your shoes to train for an ultramarathon when it is pouring rain, you are nursing a stress fracture, and the ambient temperature is below freezing. Consistency dictates doing it the same. Persistence dictates doing it regardless.
And this brings us to the theoretical synthesis the sources refer to as the compounding effect. The literature makes a compelling argument that neither trait operates optimally in isolation. They require a symbiotic relationship to produce exponential outcomes.
This is the intersection that I found so intellectually satisfying. We are all intimately familiar with the mathematical concept of compounding in finance, the snowball effect of compound interest. But when you apply that mathematical model to human behavior, consistency serves as the stable base. It is the principal investment and the reliable yield.
Yes, but persistence is what provides the elongated temporal horizon necessary for that exponential mathematical curve to actually steepen and go vertical.
Because without consistency, your persistent effort is just a chaotic scattergraph. Consider an individual who is fiercely persistent about physiological adaptation. They want to build muscle mass, so they subject themselves to excruciating maximal effort workouts. They endure immense physical pain, demonstrating high persistence.
But if they only do this erratically,
Exactly. If they perform completely random, disconnected biomechanical movements once every 6 weeks, the effort fails to compound. The physiological adaptations decay before the next stimulus is applied. They endure the suffering, but they never actually change their baseline physiology.
but the inverse is equally catastrophic. Without persistence, your perfectly calibrated consistency is utterly irrelevant. You could engineer the most biologically optimized, frictionless, perfectly consistent daily routine known to science. But if your temporal horizon is 3 days because you abandon the protocol the moment you encounter environmental friction, you never cross the threshold required to trigger systemic change.
You fundamentally require the structural reliability of consistency, permanently welded to the temporal endurance of persistence.
Which serves as the perfect bridge into the neurobiology of this entire dynamic. Because it is incredibly easy for us to stand here on the pavement, dissecting this philosophically, and prescribing consistency and persistence as if they are merely choices made by a virtuous character. But the human capacity to execute these behaviors is not some ethereal moral failing or triumph.
No, it is aggressively hardwired into and constrained by specific neural architectures and neurochemical pathways in your brain.
The biological determinism of it is staggering.
Let's look at the brain's internal cost-benefit analysis, because maintaining this continuity is metabolically exorbitant. And the entire operation is overseen by the prefrontal cortex, the PFC, right behind your forehead.
The PFC is the primary executive suite for top-down regulation. For an organism to demonstrate what we call persistence, the PFC must actively maintain a high-resolution mental representation of a distal goal, a target that exists far off in the temporal distance while simultaneously suppressing the deep evolutionary urge to consume immediate, readily available gratification.
Now, we're all familiar with the classic Stanford marshmallow experiment narrative, right? The 1970 study where a child sits in a room with a marshmallow, and they are told if they wait 15 minutes, they get a second one. The traditional takeaway was always just a blunt measurement of willpower. The kids who waited had better PFC regulation and therefore better life outcomes.
That was the accepted dogma for decades.
But the sources we've been reading dig into the 2018 replication of that study by Watts, Duncan, and Kwan, which completely shatters that simplistic interpretation.
The replication study is vital because it introduces the environmental variable to the biological hardware. What the newer data demonstrated is that the capacity to delay gratification isn't just a measure of isolated cognitive control. It is heavily modulated by the child's socioeconomic background and their internal algorithm for environmental trust.
This is a massive paradigm shift. If a child comes from an environment of scarcity, or an environment where adults are historically unreliable, their PFC isn't failing when they eat the marshmallow immediately. Their brain is executing a highly rational, statistically sound algorithm.
Exactly. In a low-trust environment, a promised future reward is mathematically less likely to materialize than the guaranteed caloric density sitting directly in front of them right now.
Their executive function is working perfectly. It has just calculated that the cost of persistence is an unacceptable risk. The lateral PFC provides the structural basis for behavioral consistency by selectively inhibiting task-irrelevant information and impulses, but it bases that inhibition on the perceived reliability of the world.
And regardless of the environment, enforcing that inhibition is wildly expensive from a caloric standpoint. The PFC suffers from profound fatigue, which is why we need to spend a significant amount of time looking at the actual engine of continuity dopamine.
Oh, absolutely. The cultural lexicon has completely bastardized the concept of dopamine. People constantly talk about dopamine detoxes or seeking a dopamine hit from social media, framing it exclusively as the pleasure chemical. But its actual mechanical role in regulating persistence is so much more sophisticated.
It is deeply misunderstood. The classical model of dopamine as a simple reward neurotransmitter. You perform a task, you receive a reward, dopamine is released to make you feel subjective pleasure, is an archaic simplification.
What's the contemporary consensus then?
It centers entirely on the mesolimbic dopamine pathway and the mechanism of reward prediction error, or RPE.
Reward prediction error. Let's really map out the mechanics of this because it's fascinating. Dopamine neurons in the midbrain do not primarily fire in response to the acquisition of a reward. They fire in response to the anticipation of the reward.
And crucially, they code for the delta, the mathematical difference between the anticipated value of the reward and the actual received value.
To contextualize this, think about Wolfram Schultz's seminal work with primates. If you condition a monkey to associate a light flash with a delivery of apple juice, initially the dopamine spikes when the juice hits their tongue.
But once the association is learned, the dopamine spike migrates backwards in time. It spikes the exact millisecond the light flashes. The brain is simulating the future acquisition of the juice.
And this is exactly what is happening to us right now on this street. We are cold, our feet hurt, and we are fatigued. But we possess a high-resolution mental model of the kebab we are about to receive.
We know the exact thermal properties of the meat, the sodium levels, the texture of the bread.
Right. That mental simulation triggers an anticipatory release of dopamine right now, while we are standing here enduring the friction of the wait. That anticipatory release is the neurochemical currency that funds your persistence.
Your brain is essentially fronting you the metabolic cash required to tolerate the environmental stressors. Behavioral persistence is maintained not by sheer grit, but by the brain's capacity to continuously simulate a distal reward with enough fidelity that the resulting dopamine release offsets the immediate somatic effort costs.
But where the error in reward prediction error becomes critical is the moment of acquisition. If the vendor hands us our food in a moment and he has unexpectedly thrown in an extra portion of chips free of charge, our brains will register a positive prediction error.
Because the actual value exceeded the simulated value.
Exactly. This triggers a massive secondary dopamine spike, which physically rewires the synaptic weights in the brain to reinforce the specific behavioral pathway that led us to this specific shop. It screams, update the algorithm, this behavior is highly profitable, persist in it.
Conversely, if he hands over the food, the bread is stale, the meat is cold, and he has absolutely drenched it in that aggressive chili sauce you specifically asked him to avoid,
we experience a negative prediction error, and this is brutal. The dopamine firing rate drops significantly below its normal baseline. You experience that visceral, sinking wave of disappointment.
and your neural circuitry aggressively updates the algorithm in the opposite direction to remediate this behavioral sequence. The caloric and temporal cost of the wait was not justified by the yield.
This specific mechanism explains why maintaining persistence over a multi-year timeline, like executing a complex piece of software engineering or acquiring a PhD, is so notoriously difficult. The subject is continuously hemorrhaging metabolic energy against the effort costs of the work, and they must constantly self-generate highly abstract anticipatory dopamine to sustain forward motion.
Often for years before the actual external reward manifests.
And the complexity deepens because we aren't just dealing with a monolithic release of a chemical. The literature draws a hard boundary between tonic and phasic dopamine dynamics. And you have to understand both to understand continuity.
Let's break those down.
Tonic dopamine is your baseline concentration in the extracellular space. Think of it as the idle RPM of an engine. It dictates your generalized ambient motivation and your overall willingness to deploy effort into the world on any given day.
Correct. If your tonic dopamine levels are depressed, initiating any action feels like moving through a highly viscous fluid. Even routine tasks require immense top-down PFC overrides. But phasic dopamine refers to the rapid, transient spikes, the high-amplitude bursts that occur in response to specific cues.
Like the positive prediction errors we just discussed.
Precisely. So mapping this back to our definitions, your tonic dopamine provides the persistent, underlying drive to pursue a multi-year goal, while the phasic dopamine spikes you receive from intermediate wins, like finishing a difficult subtask, reinforce the highly consistent daily behavioral habits required to get there.
You require the baseline idle of the engine to keep the system alive, and you need the phasic acceleration to navigate specific obstacles.
And the neural architecture responsible for integrating all of this data, monitoring the tonic levels, calculating the phasic spikes, and measuring the muscular and cognitive fatigue is the Anterior Cingulate Cortex, the ACC.
The ACC is essentially the brain's chief financial officer. Its sole function is to continuously run a ruthless cost-benefit analysis on your existence.
The ACC is calculating the absolute metabolic and temporal cost of your current behavior and weighing it against the abstract simulated value of the goal. It is continuously asking, on a millisecond basis, is the yield of this activity worth the energetic expenditure?
And the clinical data is fascinating here. Individuals who demonstrate massive anomalous levels of persistence, ultra-endurance athletes, elite-level researchers operating at the bleeding edge of their fields, often possess a naturally elevated threshold for effort-based exhaustion within their ACC.
Which means their internal CFO is significantly more permissive regarding massive energetic expenditures. When an average individual engages in a highly demanding cognitive or physical task, their ACC quickly hits a threshold and broadcasts an abort signal. It manifests as a feeling of overwhelming fatigue or frustration.
But the highly persistent phenotype possesses an ACC that acknowledges the high cost, but effectively overrides the abort signal, authorizing the system to push deeper into the red. It is the biological difference between capitulating early and sustaining hard graft.
And for context, hard graft, which is a term we use relentlessly over here, refers to deeply physical, taxing labor. It's the kind of work that strips you down to your absolute core.
But the irony is that the brain fundamentally detests hard graft. From an evolutionary perspective, burning through executive resources in the PFC and constantly negotiating with the ACC is a dangerous waste of calories. The brain wants efficiency, so it evolved a structural bypass.
The basal ganglia. This is where the structural nature of consistency actually rescues the temporal nature of persistence. While persistence relies on that exhaustive, top-down, volitional effort driven by the PFC, consistency eventually triggers a neuroplastic migration.
Through sheer, relentless repetition.
Yes. The execution of a behavioral sequence shifts away from the energy-intensive cortical areas and sinks down into the phylogenetically older, deeper structures of the brain, specifically the striatum within the basal ganglia.
This is the phenomenon of chunking. The brain identifies a complex, multi-step sequence of actions that are consistently performed together, and it essentially compiles them into a single executable macro command.
Once that behavior is encoded in the basal ganglia as a habit, initiating it bypasses the PFC entirely, and more importantly, it evades the constant, suffocating cost-benefit scrutiny of the ACC.
That is precisely why an action like driving a car, which initially requires massive cognitive load and high persistence to learn, eventually becomes entirely automated. You don't negotiate with your ACC to check your mirrors. The sequence is chunked.
Therefore, the ultimate optimization strategy for long-term endurance is utilizing high consistency to aggressively offload the metabolic cost of behaviors to the basal ganglia. You synthesize an autopilot, insulating your finite reservoir of executive willpower from the daily operational costs of your goals.
But let me introduce some friction here. If the ultimate goal is to offload everything to the basal ganglia to save energy, doesn't that inherently make us rigid automatons? If a behavior is chunked and bypasses the ACC's critical evaluation, how do we stop persisting in a behavior that has become maladaptive? The brain has optimized it, but what if the environment changes and the habit is now destructive?
That is the precise vulnerability of the system, and it's a brilliant point. The basal ganglia is agnostic to morality or long-term utility. It only cares about efficiency.
So how do you break it?
Breaking a chunked habit requires re-engaging the PFC to actively suppress the automated striatal output, which requires a massive surge of, you guessed it, top-down cognitive effort and tonic dopamine. This is why untangling a deeply ingrained, highly consistent bad habit is often more metabolically exhausting than building a new one from scratch.
You essentially have to manually override the autopilot while the plane is flying. It's a terrifying biological reality. Smell that hot oil coming from the shop, by the way.
Yeah.
Watching him methodically shear that meat down, it's a perfect visual for this relentless mechanical repetition.
It really is.
And it actually pivots us perfectly away from the biology and into the historical sociology of these sources. Because while we sit here analyzing the neurochemical efficiency of the basal ganglia and treating these traits as productivity optimizations, historical paradigms viewed them through a wildly different, deeply moral lens.
The contemporary framework is almost entirely utilitarian. We optimize for yield. But if we trace the intellectual lineage back to classical virtue ethics, specifically the Hellenistic philosophy of the Stoics, persistence and consistency were not methodologies for achieving external goals. They were the ultimate ends in themselves.
The Stoics elevated constantia, steadfastness, and consistency of character to the level of a cardinal virtue, and you cannot discuss this without looking deeply at Epictetus.
To contextualize this, Epictetus spent his youth as a slave in Rome. His foundational premise was forged in an environment where he had absolute zero physical or environmental autonomy.
He formulated this concept of prohairesis, which is arguably the most important concept in Stoic psychology. Prohairesis translates roughly to the volitional faculty or the core engine of moral choice.
Epictetus argued, quite rationally given his background, that the external world is inherently chaotic and fundamentally adversarial. Your physical health, your financial status, the geopolitical climate, your social reputation, none of these are subject to your direct control. They are vulnerable to the whims of fortune.
Therefore, attaching your psychological stability to the acquisition of external rewards is a recipe for guaranteed suffering. The only domain over which you possess absolute, unassailable sovereignty is your prohairesis.
So for the Stoics, consistency wasn't about ensuring you practiced the lute every day to become a famous musician. It was about maintaining a rigid internal harmony with the logos, the universal rational order of the cosmos, regardless of the external data inputs.
If you were elevated to the status of an emperor, your character remained consistent. If you were suddenly stripped of all rank, exiled, and thrown into a freezing cell, your character remained entirely unchanged. You persisted in your moral framework.
It was an internalization of the metric for success. You didn't evaluate your life by the yield of your actions, but by the structural consistency of your character while executing them.
But as the sources brilliantly map out, this philosophical framework was completely violently upended by the largest paradigm shift in human history, the Industrial Revolution.
The shift from agrarian societies to mechanized industry completely rewired the human psychological relationship with effort.
If you look at labor before the 18th century, let's look at the cottage industries, or standard agricultural farming labor was fundamentally task-oriented. The temporal boundaries of work were dictated by the natural world and the requirements of the specific task.
E.P. Thompson's historical analysis of this is essential. In a task-oriented society, when a crop needed harvesting, the community engaged in bursts of immense, heroic persistence. They worked from dawn until midnight, pushing their physiology to the breaking point.
But crucially, when the harvest was secured, the labor ceased. The subsequent days or weeks were characterized by rest and low output. The human behavioral rhythm mimicked the seasonal rhythm.
But then you introduce the mechanized textile mills of Manchester, and the steam engine introduces a terrifying new variable. The machine does not require sleep, is not affected by the seasons, and it represents a massive capital investment that must generate continuous returns.
Therefore, the machine must run consistently, 24 hours a day. And suddenly, human labor had to be violently contorted to match the structural consistency of the machine. We transitioned from task-oriented labor to time-oriented labor.
You no longer worked until the intrinsic goal was achieved. You sold a strictly demarcated block of your time, a 12-hour shift, during which you were expected to execute repetitive microtasks with the exact same consistency as the loom you were operating.
But you cannot simply force a biological organism that evolved for varied, task-oriented bursts to suddenly operate like a metronome without massive psychological friction.
Which brings us to Max Weber and the Protestant ethic in the spirit of capitalism. Weber asked the critical question, what psychological apparatus was powerful enough to compel humans to accept this unnatural, relentless consistency?
And his answer was that the culture fundamentally weaponized theology.
Weber argued that the Calvinist doctrine of the calling provided the psychological infrastructure for industrial capitalism. The theology evolved to suggest that relentless, methodical, highly consistent labor in one's secular profession was not just an economic necessity, it was an expression of religious devotion.
Demonstrating perfect consistency in your work became the visible proof of your invisible state of grace. It effectively moralized the factory clock. If you weren't consistently producing output, you weren't just poor, you were damned.
We moved away from the episodic, heroic persistence of the explorer or the farmer and sanctified the unbroken mechanical consistency of the factory worker.
And the profound insight of the sources is that even though Western society has largely secularized, the psychological scaffolding of that Protestant work ethic remains completely intact in our neurobiology. We have entirely internalized the metronome.
This is why, in the modern knowledge economy, if an individual decides to take a random Tuesday afternoon off simply to rest, they are invariably swamped by a deeply ingrained sense of guilt.
The task might be finished, but because they are not demonstrating consistent temporal output, their internal programming signals that they are committing a moral transgression against the god of productivity. It's a haunting realization.
But the sources don't stop at Weber. They introduce a counter-narrative from the mid-20th century that addresses the psychological despair of this mechanical consistency. And that is the existentialist critique, specifically Albert Camus and his interpretation of the myth of Sisyphus.
Camus provides arguably the most sophisticated philosophical exploration of persistence in the modern canon. The mythological framework is straightforward. Sisyphus is condemned by the gods to an eternity of agonizing labor. He must push a massive boulder up the incline of a mountain.
But the physics of the punishment are designed so that the moment he approaches the summit, the boulder slips from his grasp and rolls all the way back down to the valley floor. He must then descend and begin the process again.
It is the absolute distillation of an absurd, completely meaningless task. There is zero compounding effect. There is no positive reward prediction error because the system is rigged to ensure the reward is permanently deferred. It is an eternity of pure, unadulterated friction.
But Camus utilizes this mythological torture to formulate a profound allegory for the human condition. His foundational premise is that the universe itself is fundamentally absurd. It is silent, it is devoid of inherent meaning, and it offers absolutely no guaranteed correlation between human effort and cosmic reward.
We demand meaning from a universe that is incapable of providing it. So how does an individual function in the face of this terrifying reality? Do we succumb to nihilism?
Camus argues no. He posits that the act of pushing the rock, the sheer, unrelenting persistence of the individual in the face of an absurd reality, generates its own localized meaning. The famous concluding thought of the essay is, one must imagine Sisyphus happy.
And he doesn't mean happy in a superficial, joyful sense. He means that Sisyphus attains a state of lucid, defiant triumph.
Because in a universe that is completely indifferent to your existence, your refusal to surrender is the ultimate assertion of your sovereignty. Every single time Sisyphus turns around at the top of the mountain and begins the long walk back down to the valley to engage the boulder again, he is in a state of conscious rebellion against the absurdity of his condition.
His persistence transcends mere habit or industrial obligation. It becomes the defining act of human dignity. It's an incredibly potent psychological reframe.
Absolutely.
When you are totally depleted, facing an inbox that instantly refills the moment you clear it, which is the modern corporate equivalent of the boulder, you aren't persisting because you believe you will eventually achieve some utopian state of inbox zero. You persist because the execution of the effort, the refusal to let the chaos overrun you, is the mechanism by which you assert your existence.
But if we transition away from the philosophical abstractions of Camus and ground these concepts in the hard sciences, systems theory, thermodynamics, structural engineering, we discover that consistency and persistence are not merely human psychological coping mechanisms.
They are the fundamental physical laws that govern the survival of any complex system in the universe. Let's look at the physics of survival, specifically dynamics and the Lindy effect. Because this is where the source material transitions from describing how humans feel to describing how the physical universe operates.
In biological and thermodynamic systems, structural consistency is conceptualized as homeostasis, or a steady state. And we need to define this precisely because the terminology is frequently butchered.
The colloquial misunderstanding is that a steady state implies a state of rest, or thermodynamic equilibrium, like a boulder sitting motionless in a valley.
But in complex systems, true equilibrium is death. A steady state is actually a condition of aggressive, continuous energy flux. The system is actively burning energy to maintain its internal parameters against the entropic pressure of the environment.
The classic physiological example is thermal regulation while running. You are on a treadmill. Your physical location is highly consistent. You aren't moving anywhere. But to maintain that steady state, your body is engaged in a massive, coordinated energetic expenditure.
Your core temperature rises, triggering the vasodilation of capillaries and the activation of sweat glands to dissipate heat. Your cardiovascular system dramatically increases output to deliver oxygen to the mitochondria.
Homeostasis is not rest. It is a highly coordinated, relentless defense of consistency. And within this paradigm, persistence is mapped to the concept of resilience. Resilience is defined mathematically as the capacity of a system to absorb a perturbation, a shock, or an external force and successfully return to its steady-state baseline.
If the treadmill suddenly surges in speed, your resilience is measured by how quickly your neuromotor system adjusts your stride to prevent catastrophic failure, bringing you back to the consistent rhythm.
Which leads us directly into what I consider the most intellectually disruptive concept in this entire curriculum, the Lindy effect. We really need to dissect this because once you integrate this mental model, it completely alters how you evaluate the validity of ideas, technologies, and institutions.
The Lindy effect is a heuristic derived from the mathematics of non-perishable entities. We are not applying this to biological organisms with built-in cellular senescence. A human being has a fixed biological limit. The older a human gets, the shorter the remaining life expectancy becomes.
But the Lindy effect applies to information, cultural norms, technologies, and intellectual frameworks. And it dictates a deeply counterintuitive power law for non-perishable things. Their future life expectancy is directly proportional to their current age.
It is profound. If you take a piece of information, let's use the Stoic texts of Epictetus we just discussed. Those writings have maintained their cultural consistency and persisted through human history for roughly 2 millennia.
During those 2,000 years, the system of human civilization has been subjected to unimaginable perturbations. The collapse of the Roman Empire, the bubonic plague, the Dark Ages, the Industrial Revolution, the advent of nuclear weapons, and the dawn of the Internet.
And because that specific philosophical framework survived every single one of those massive systemic shocks without being discarded, the Lindy effect dictates that it has demonstrated an extraordinary, mathematically proven level of systemic fitness.
Therefore, statistically, we can project with high confidence that Epictetus will continue to be read and utilized by humans 2,000 years in the future. Contrast that with a newly published, massively hyped self-help book that topped the bestseller list last week. The author might be on every talk show, but the ideas contained in that book have a Lindy age of 0.
They have not been subjected to the abrasive forces of time and environmental perturbation. Statistically, it is overwhelmingly probable that the book will be entirely forgotten in 5 years.
The sheer persistence of an idea across deep time is a self-reinforcing signal that the idea contains some fundamental, irreducible utility or alignment with reality. Time acts as the ultimate filter for fragility.
However, we must acknowledge that systems do fail. The literature details the mechanics of systemic collapse, which invariably occurs when the regulatory mechanisms maintaining consistency break down, trapping the system in what engineers call a positive feedback loop.
And it's crucial to clarify the nomenclature here. In systems theory, positive does not mean beneficial. It means amplifying or self-reinforcing. It implies the system has lost its regulatory brakes and is accelerating away from its baseline.
Precisely. Let's examine macroeconomic systems. A functioning market relies entirely on the structural consistency of price signals. Market participants generally agree on the relative value of a commodity or an equity. But if that consistent signal is suddenly shattered, perhaps by a sudden geopolitical shock, the system can enter a positive feedback loop.
Volatility spikes. This volatility triggers algorithmic and human mechanic selling, which drives the price down further, which triggers margin calls and more aggressive selling. The output of the system becomes the input for the next cycle, amplifying the chaos.
The steady state disintegrates. And here's where we see the danger of misapplying persistence. In an environment characterized by a runaway positive feedback loop, where the underlying systemic logic has broken down, demonstrating persistence is mathematically suicidal.
If you persistently buy into an equity that is in a structural freefall because the fundamental valuation model has collapsed, you will simply be annihilated. For a system to survive over the long term, it must heavily feature negative feedback loops, regulatory mechanisms designed specifically to dampen extreme fluctuations and pull the system back toward the safety of the consistent baseline.
The specific understanding of regulation and variance is exactly what structural engineers and materials scientists must design for when they construct the physical infrastructure of our world.
The mechanical engineering principles regarding repetition and failure map onto human behavioral psychology with terrifying precision. We should examine high-end manufacturing and the statistical concept of tolerance. Let's get into the Six Sigma methodology.
When you are manufacturing mission-critical components, let's say turbine blades for a commercial jet engine or implantable cardiac pacemakers, the tolerance for variance is practically microscopic.
Consistency is quantified using sigma levels, which represent standard deviations from the mean in a normal distribution. A process operating at 6 sigma implies that the manufacturing output remains within the defined quality parameters 99.99966% of the time.
To put that into perspective, it equates to producing fewer than 3.4 defective parts per 1 million opportunities. It is a level of structural consistency that borders on the absolute limits of physical reality.
That the engineers are fully aware of the laws of entropy. They know that absolute perfection over an infinite time horizon is impossible. Components will eventually degrade and fail. So how does an engineer ensure the persistence of the entire system when they know individual components will inevitably fail?
They introduced the concept of redundancy. Mechanical redundancy is the literal physical embodiment of systemic persistence. If you are at cruising altitude in a Boeing 777 and the primary hydraulic system driving the control surfaces experiences a catastrophic failure, the aircraft does not fall out of the sky.
There is an entirely separate secondary hydraulic system running in parallel. If that fails, there is a tertiary system. The individual parts are allowed to fail so that the macro system can persist in its state of flight.
But redundancy cannot cheat physics forever. And this brings us to a metallurgical concept that the sources highlight, which I found to be the most chillingly accurate metaphor for human psychological breakdown in the entire corpus, material fatigue, and the phenomenon of creep.
Creep is such a phenomenally evocative term for it. Let's unpick the mechanics of this. Every solid material on Earth, whether it's structural steel, reinforced concrete, or aerospace-grade titanium, possesses a specific metric known as a fatigue limit.
When engineers study persistence in materials, they aren't just calculating the maximum static load a beam can hold. They are calculating exactly how many cycles of low-level, repetitive, consistent stress the material can endure before the crystalline structure fails.
The classic demonstration is taking a standard metal paperclip. You can bend it a few degrees, and it demonstrates perfect resilience. It returns to its shape. The stress is well below its yield strength, but if you persistently bend it back and forth, you are applying cyclic fatigue.
You are introducing microscopic dislocations into the atomic lattice of the metal. Eventually, those microscopic flaws coalesce into a macro crack, and the paperclip snaps abruptly.
But the phenomenon of creep is vastly more insidious than cyclic fatigue. Creep is defined as the tendency of a solid material to slowly, permanently deform under the influence of persistent, long-term mechanical stress, even if that stress is orders of magnitude lower than the material's actual yield strength.
Consider the structural mechanics of a steel suspension bridge. The engineering specifications might dictate that the bridge can support a maximum dynamic load of 100,000 tons. Now imagine the bridge only ever experiences a daily traffic load of 20,000 tons.
It is never, at any point, subjected to a load that should threaten its structural integrity. It never experiences an acute, catastrophic overload.
But the relentless, persistent, highly consistent application of those 20,000 tons, day after day, decade after decade, alongside the thermal expansion and contraction from the sun, causes the individual steel molecules to microscopically slide past one another.
The internal geometry of the metal fundamentally alters. The bridge slowly, imperceptibly sags. It permanently loses its original shape. It is the absolute perfect analog for the modern epidemic of human burnout.
Our cultural narrative regarding burnout always frames it as an acute, dramatic snapping point. We imagine someone taking on a massive, high-stakes project and suddenly suffering a total psychological collapse under the sheer weight of the endeavor.
But clinical observation suggests that the vast majority of human burnout is not a dramatic snap, it is psychological creep. It is the slow, permanent deformation of your cognitive and emotional resilience caused by the relentless persistence of low-level ambient stressors.
It's the daily friction of a 90-minute commute, the unending barrage of emails, the low-grade financial anxiety, the constant pressure to maintain a curated digital persona.
None of these stressors individually approach your psychological yield strength. You can handle all of them today, but the persistent application of these micro-stressors over a 5-year horizon literally deforms your psychological architecture. You don't break suddenly. You just slowly lose your shape.
Which necessitates proactive engineering on a personal level. If a civil engineer knows a bridge will experience creep, they must design highly specific maintenance schedules and off-ramps for the stress.
If you do not actively engineer periods of profound downregulation, true systemic rest, to allow the psychological lattice to repair, you will inevitably experience structural failure. This maps perfectly onto the formal psychological frameworks the sources dedicate so much time to.
Because modern cognitive psychology has spent the last 2 decades obsessively trying to quantify this razor-thin boundary between heroic perseverance and catastrophic rigid breakdown. And we have to address Angela Duckworth's research on grit.
Duckworth's grit scale has permeated the corporate and educational zeitgeist, but the underlying empirical research is robust and highly relevant. She defines grit precisely as passion and perseverance for very long-term goals.
It is the ultimate psychological synthesis of the two variables we have been tracking: consistency of interest or passion, perfectly hybridized with persistence of effort or perseverance.
Her longitudinal studies are deeply revealing because they demonstrate that in highly demanding, hyper-competitive environments, she tracked cadets navigating the brutal initiation at West Point, competitors in the National Spelling Bee, and candidates in the Green Beret selection course GRIT is consistently a superior predictor of successful completion than raw, baseline intelligence or innate talent.
The mechanism is straightforward. The individual with the highest IQ or the greatest physical gifts often coasts through the early stages of a challenge. But the moment they encounter a friction point that requires massive effort, a threshold they have never had to cross before their ACC triggers an immediate abort sequence.
The gritty individual, who may possess a lower baseline capacity but a vastly superior tolerance for negative reward prediction errors, simply refuses to terminate the sequence.
But the literature immediately introduces a crucial caveat via the work of Anders Ericsson. Because if we just preach grit and relentless consistency, we fall into the trap of mindless repetition.
We are all aware of Malcolm Gladwell's popularization of the 10,000-hour rule. The pervasive cultural idea that dedicating 10,000 hours to a task guarantees world-class mastery. The sources detail how deeply frustrated Ericsson was by this popularization because it fundamentally amputated the most critical variable of his actual research.
Gladwell's simplification equated time and system with mastery. But Ericsson vehemently argued that mindlessly repeating a task with high consistency for 10,000 hours does not generate expertise. It merely calcifies your current level of mediocrity.
You just become highly, flawlessly consistent at executing bad habits. True mastery is governed by a vastly more agonizing process known as deliberate practice.
Let's define deliberate practice because it requires a mode of persistence that is deeply antagonistic to the brain's natural desire for efficiency.
We discussed how the brain wants to offload behaviors to the basal ganglia to form effortless, chunked habits. Deliberate practice is the conscious, volitional act of violently resisting that automation. It requires you to consistently apply effort while hyper-focusing exclusively on the specific micro-components of the task that you currently perform poorly.
You must intentionally force your neurobiology to remain in what cognitive scientists term the stretch zone, or the zone of proximal development. This is a state where the cognitive load is continually maxed out, the error rate is high, and the positive dopamine reinforcement is sparse because you are deliberately operating at the edge of failure.
Sustaining this requires a massive, continuous reservoir of tonic dopamine because the behavior is profoundly uncomfortable. But, and this is arguably the most critical warning light flashing in the entire source library, there is a terrifying dark side to all this highly celebrated grit and deliberate practice.
The psychological literature formally identifies it as the persistence paradox. This is the inflection point where persistence ceases to be a functional virtue and mutates into a catastrophic liability.
In behavioral economics and psychology, it is termed irrational persistence, but the general public understands the mechanism primarily through the lens of the sunk cost fallacy. In organizational behavior, it is codified as the Stah effect, named after the foundational research by Barry Stah.
The Stah effect is something we all need to deeply internalize. It defines the deeply irrational yet highly predictable tendency for individuals, corporate entities, or even entire geopolitical actors to actively escalate their commitment of resources, time, capital, emotional energy to a demonstrably failing course of action for the sole reason that they have already invested heavily in it.
The historical case studies are monumental. Consider the Concorde fallacy. The British and French governments engaged in the joint development of the Concorde supersonic jet. Long before the aircraft was operational, the financial projections definitively proved that the project would never be economically viable.
The fuel costs were astronomical, and the sonic boom restrictions limited its routes. The rational, mathematical decision was to terminate the project and absorb the initial losses.
But the Stah effect dominated the executive decision-making. The political actors looked at the billions of dollars already burned and the geopolitical prestige on the line, and their psychology rebelled against the negative prediction error of admitting failure.
So they escalated. They poured billions more into completing a spectacular engineering marvel that functioned as a massive flying financial hemorrhage for its entire operational life. They demonstrated world-class persistence, but it was entirely pathologically rigid.
And here is the terrifying reality for the individual. Distinguishing between highly productive grit pushing through the agonizing trough of disillusionment in a viable project, and pathological rigidity, refusing to accept that the Concorde is mathematically doomed, is one of the most difficult cognitive tasks a human can undertake.
Because internally, the somatic markers feel entirely identical. The sheer force of will required to finish writing a brilliant, complex novel feels neurologically indistinguishable from the irrational persistence of draining your life savings into a failing startup that the market has already rejected.
The internal sensations are identical, which is exactly why the systems theory principles we discussed are so vital. If you cannot rely on your internal feelings to differentiate grit from a sunk cost, you must rely on external negative feedback loops. You fundamentally require trusted external advisors or hard, objective data metrics that are authorized to bypass your ego and tell you when your persistence has mutated into pathological rigidity.
We've analyzed the biology, the history, and the engineering. Let's bring this completely into the present moment. Let's have a proper look at how this entire dynamic of consistency and persistence is being radically mutated by the environment we currently inhabit.
The sources make a highly compelling, somewhat dystopian argument that in the 21st century, humanity is actively outsourcing the architecture of its own continuity to the digital panopticon.
We've transitioned into an algorithmic reality. And the fundamental characteristic of digital systems is that they are capable of executing structural consistency at a level of perfection that is biologically impossible for an organic system.
We marveled at Six Sigma manufacturing achieving 99.99966% consistency. An algorithmic logic gate operates at 100% consistency within its defined parameters.
Look at the architecture of our modern financial systems. High-frequency trading algorithms currently dominate global equity markets. These are non-biological entities, executing millions of microtransactions in milliseconds, driven by purely consistent mathematical models of tiny price discrepancies.
Look at global automated supply chain logistics that track inventory metrics and reorder physical goods the microsecond a threshold is breached. Look at the content recommendation engines, the algorithms currently mediating human culture on our devices. They are entirely reliant on the persistence of data.
We have engineered a frictionless environment where absolute rigid consistency is the default operational state. But this introduces a profound structural vulnerability into human civilization, which the literature categorizes as the fragility issue.
If we refer back to the Lindy effect and complex systems theory, natural biological systems survive deep time precisely because they possess localized inconsistencies. They have slack. They can bend, adapt, and absorb perturbation.
But when you construct an artificially perfect, highly optimized, 100% consistent algorithmic system, it becomes exquisitely vulnerable to the phenomenon Nassim Taleb defines as the black swan.
Right, and let's define the mechanics of a black swan within this context. A black swan is an incredibly rare, highly impactful event that sits completely outside the realm of normal probabilistic expectations. Crucially, it represents a massive environmental inconsistency that the algorithmic system was never programmed to recognize, let alone process.
Exactly. When a biological system encounters a novel threat, it adapts gradually. But when a hyper-consistent, perfectly rigid algorithmic system encounters a black swan data input, it does not bend. Because its operational logic is flawless and inflexible, the system attempts to process the anomaly using its standard protocol, which instantly triggers a catastrophic cascade.
The collapse is not gradual. It is total and instantaneous. We have empirical evidence of this. Consider the flash crash of 2010. The global financial markets lost nearly $1 trillion in value in roughly 36 minutes.
Why? Because a relatively minor, anomalous sell order spoofing algorithm triggered a cascading, perfectly consistent reaction among all the other high-frequency trading algorithms.
They all reacted exactly as programmed, simultaneously withdrawing liquidity and dumping assets. The perfectly consistent system generated perfect fragility, nearly breaking the global economy. And this demand for algorithmic consistency is no longer confined to macroeconomics. It has aggressively infiltrated human sociology.
The sources devote significant analytical weight to the psychological ramifications of the Internet's permanent record.
This specific section of the reading genuinely disturbed me. I was properly gutted, absolutely devastated by the implications of it. Consider the baseline reality of human interaction prior to the digital epoch. For hundreds of thousands of years, human behavioral errors exhibited extremely low persistence.
If an individual expressed a deeply flawed opinion or made a social transgression in a tavern in 1985, the local community might recall the event for a few weeks. But human memory is highly entropic. The data degrades. The community eventually forgets, and the error effectively evaporates from reality.
That ambient entropy, the low persistence of our errors, was a critical evolutionary feature, not a bug. It provided the sociological grace necessary for cognitive evolution. It allowed an individual to hold a flawed hypothesis, encounter negative feedback, discard the hypothesis, and adopt a more accurate model without being permanently chained to their previous iteration.
But the architecture of the modern internet enforces absolute, terrifying data persistence. Every digital interaction, every impulsive tweet, every photograph, every poorly formulated argument you articulated when your prefrontal cortex wasn't even fully developed is captured and cryogenically frozen in the server farms of Silicon Valley.
We are the first generation of humans forced to live alongside an immortal, immutable, permanent record of our entire cognitive evolution, and the psychological distortion this creates is profound.
The sources theorize that this architecture has generated a sociological environment where maintaining the appearance of absolute rigid consistency in your public persona is prioritized above actual intellectual growth.
Individuals are paralyzed by the fear of adopting a new perspective because the internet's immune system will immediately retrieve a data point from a decade ago to bludgeon them with accusations of hypocrisy. It fundamentally criminalizes intellectual maturation.
Genuine human growth requires you to be wildly inconsistent over time. To learn, you must hold a flawed model, realize it is flawed, and contradict your former self.
But the permanent record punishes that experimental persistence. It demands that biological humans operate with the rigid, unchanging consistency of a brand identity algorithm. It is a profoundly unnatural and psychologically suffocating structural constraint.
It is entirely stifling. But if we want to examine a more optimistic intersection of technology and persistence, the sources highlight one incredibly robust analytical model before we transition into the practical, actionable methodologies. And that is the mechanism by which genuine innovation actually survives the brutality of the market.
The Gartner hype cycle. This is a universally recognized graphical model in venture capital and technology sectors used to track the life cycle of emerging technologies. But if you look at the axis, it is fundamentally a topographical map of human societal persistence.
It is. If you map the trajectory of any paradigm-shifting technology, let's look at the early commercialization of the internet in the late 90s, or the current iterations of generative artificial intelligence. It predictably traces a highly specific curve.
Upon introduction, the technology triggers a massive surge of speculative capital and cultural attention, rapidly ascending to what Gartner categorizes as the peak of inflated expectations. The narrative suggests the technology will instantly solve every human problem.
But the fundamental reality is that the underlying architecture of the technology is immature. It cannot possibly generate the yield demanded by the inflated expectations. This triggers a massive systemic negative reward prediction error across the entire culture,
Which initiates the catastrophic plunge into the trough of disillusionment. The speculative capital evaporates instantly. The media narrative aggressively inverts, declaring the technology a complete failure, a grift, or an irrelevant fad. The cultural attention span moves on.
And this trough is the ultimate crucible for persistence. While the broader society has completely abandoned the concept, the core developers and engineers must exhibit staggering levels of grit.
They have to inhabit that trough, entirely deprived of phasic dopamine from public validation, absorbing relentless negative feedback, and they must consistently, methodically iterate and optimize the fundamental utility of the technology.
Their persistence through the trough is the sole determining variable that dictates whether the technology dies in obscurity or eventually ascends the slope of enlightenment to reach the plateau of productivity.
The state where the technology actually integrates into the infrastructure of society and generates stable compound value. The differentiation between a forgotten fad and a world-altering disruption is rarely the initial brilliance of the idea. It is almost exclusively the sheer persistence of the engineering during the period of maximum public disillusionment.
Exactly right.
Oh, I think he's calling our order number. Yeah, that's us. Number 42. Talk about impeccable timing. As the gentleman wraps that up, I can hear the paper crinkling, which is currently generating a massive anticipatory dopamine spike in my brain. We need to rapidly synthesize all of this high-level theory into highly actionable protocols.
Because analyzing the existential despair of Camus or the structural failures of Six Sigma is intellectually stimulating, but the mandate of this conversation is application. How do we hack our own neurobiology tomorrow morning based on this data?
The foundational takeaway that underpins all the literature is an empowerment metric. Persistence and consistency are not fixed, immutable genetic traits. You are not simply born with a finite reservoir of grit.
The underlying architectures, the efficiency of your basal ganglia, the threshold of your ACC, the regulation of your dopaminergic pathways exhibit high neuroplasticity. They can be intentionally engineered and trained.
So let's break down the tactical execution. Strategy number 1 from the sources focuses on cognitive framing, identity-based consistency. This is heavily adapted from the behavioral models popularized by James Clear. It requires a fundamental pivot in how we orient our prefrontal cortex.
The default human operational mode is hyper-fixated on terminal goals. We articulate targets like, I want to run a marathon or I want to write a book, but a terminal goal is a finite structural boundary.
Exactly. What occurs the morning after you successfully cross the finish line of the marathon? The terminal goal has been achieved, which means the structural framework dictating your behavior instantly dissolves.
The ACC no longer has a distal reward to justify the metabolic cost of a 5 a.m. training run. The consistency rapidly collapses and the physiological adaptations decay.
Therefore, the identity-based methodology dictates that you must completely decouple your persistence from the terminal outcome and attach it instead to a core identity narrative. You do not state, I am attempting to run a marathon. You reprogram the narrative to, I am a runner, and identity is infinite. It persists long after the specific localized goal is achieved.
It fundamentally rewires the cost-benefit parameters within the ACC. The internal calculation shifts. It is no longer asking, is the metabolic cost of this run justified by the acquisition of a medal in 6 months? It asks, would failing to execute this run violate the core structural consistency of my defined identity?
The friction of the action becomes less painful than the psychological dissonance of contradicting who you believe you are. That is a phenomenal reframe. Now, strategy number 2 is arguably the most tactically effective because it directly addresses the brain's inherent laziness. The 2-minute rule.
We discussed at length how the anterior cingulate cortex operates as a highly conservative bouncer, constantly evaluating the effort cost of an action. If your systemic energy is low, the ACC raises the barrier to entry, your motivation fails to clear the threshold, and the behavioral sequence is aborted.
The objective, therefore, is to cognitively outmaneuver the ACC by artificially lowering the barrier to entry so drastically that the effort cost approaches zero. You take the highly complex, metabolically expensive behavior you wish to encode, and you compress it into a microaction that requires 2 minutes or less to execute.
Right. You do not attempt to force your exhausted brain to commit to a grueling 60-minute hypertrophic workout. The ACC will instantly veto that. You commit solely to the 2-minute sequence of putting on your training shoes and executing a basic dynamic stretch.
You do not commit to reading a dense chapter of a textbook. You commit to reading one single paragraph. By radically lowering the threshold, you guarantee that you can execute the action with perfect consistency, even in a state of deep fatigue.
And the brilliance of this is that it leverages the physics of momentum. Once you initiate the 2-minute sequence, you overcome the initial static friction. The basal ganglia often recognizes the pattern and takes over, and you frequently end up executing the full 60-minute workout anyway.
But even if you only do the 2 minutes and stop, you have successfully protected the structural consistency of the habit, which is the paramount objective for long-term compounding. You optimize for the repetition of the start, not the duration of the event.
Finally, strategy number 3 is a direct biochemical intervention targeting the mesolimbic pathway variable reward schedules. We established that phasic dopamine spikes are the primary reinforcers of behavior. However, neurobiology dictates that if you subject the brain to a highly predictable static reward every single time an action is performed, the system rapidly habituates.
Habituation is the enemy of persistence. If the reward is guaranteed and identical, the anticipatory RPE mechanism flattens out. The dopamine spike diminishes, and the behavior begins to feel monotonous and devoid of meaning.
So to counter this, you must introduce calculated volatility into your reinforcement protocols. You have to emulate the architecture of a slot machine. A slot machine is the most hyper-optimized behavioral reinforcement device ever engineered because the reward schedule is entirely unpredictable.
You pull the lever, and the outcome is unknown. You might receive nothing, you might receive a minor payout, or you might hit a massive jackpot. That specific uncertainty forces the brain's dopaminergic system to remain in a state of hyper-engagement.
It is desperately trying to solve the algorithmic pattern of the rewards, which generates continuous high-amplitude bursts of anticipatory dopamine.
Therefore, you must gamify your own operational protocols. Introduce controlled randomness into how you reward yourself for executing consistent habits. If you complete your deep work block, roll a dice to determine if your reward is a 10-minute break, a coffee, or a massive 45-minute walk.
By keeping the brain guessing, you prevent habituation, sustain the dopaminergic drive, and effectively fund your persistence across a multi-year horizon without succumbing to biological boredom.
All right, the transaction is complete. Grab a chip immediately before the ambient temperature ruins the structural integrity of the potato. I am genuinely starving.
Thank you. Oh, the thermal transfer on that is perfect. And the ratio of salt to vinegar is aggressive, but entirely necessary.
Absolutely brilliant. Look, we have managed to completely deconstruct the architecture of continuity tonight while simultaneously slowly freezing to death on this pavement. From the Wolfram-Schultz primate experiments driving the anticipation of these exact chips to Epictetus defending his internal citadel, all the way to the catastrophic fragility of algorithmic high-frequency trading. It is an immense volume of data to integrate into a working model.
It is a massive cognitive load. But I want to leave you, listening right now, with one final, deeply provocative concept to chew on as we finally extract ourselves from this cold and walk into the night. We spent significant time unpacking the Lindy effect, the undeniable mathematical reality that the sheer persistence of an entity across deep time is the ultimate signal of its underlying truth, utility, and systemic fitness.
If an idea survives 500 years of chaos, it is highly probable it will survive another 500. It validates its existence simply by refusing to die.
But we also just analyzed the terrifying architecture of the digital permanent record and how our current technological infrastructure forcefully imposes an artificial, inescapable persistence upon our daily actions.
That's right.
So the ultimate question we have to ask ourselves is this. Considering everything we've mapped out regarding pathological rigidity and sunk costs, what is a perfectly consistent digital habit that we as a global society are persisting in right now, an action we execute every single day with flawless machine-like regularity that will look like a completely irrational, biologically destructive sunk cost to human historians studying us 500 years from now?
Wow.
Are we utilizing this technology to construct a Lindy-compatible digital cathedral? Or are we simply Sisyphus, endlessly and absurdly scrolling a boulder up a feed?
Oof. That is an incredibly heavy diagnostic to run on our own behavior. Are we engaged in deliberate practice? Or are we just victims of algorithmic creep, slowly and permanently deforming under the invisible stress of the system? I am going to be wrestling with that specific calculation all the way back. All right, let's get moving before these ships undergo complete thermal collapse. Stay warm out there, keep the momentum going, and we'll catch you later.